Welcome to the Develop Yourself podcast, where we teach you everything you need to land your first job as a software developer by developing yourself, developing your skills, your habits, your network, and more. Today, we've got Will Sanders on the podcast. Will is the founder and CEO of Recruiting from Scratch, which is a talent firm that helps software engineers get jobs at awesome startups. We're going to be walking through what these last few months have been like with the shift from a bull to a bear market and what effect, if any, it might have on juniors. And then we'll walk through some strategies, just have some conversation around the actual outreach process. How do you get meetings? How do you build your network? And even for folks who already have jobs as software engineers, how do we make our careers resilient by continuing to stoke and build up our network? Hope you enjoy.
All right, Will, thanks so much, man, for coming on the podcast. We were talking before we started recording that. To my fault, we've been trying to have you on for a long time. But what we mainly want to get into, since you are sort of like a master of recruiting, is thinking about what it takes to land a job. I think you would suggest we talk through, if you get laid off in tech, how do you quickly sort of transition and or pivot? I'm thinking through, obviously, the lens of our audience, bootcamp grads, those learning to code. But why don't we start off, and you kind of were giving me a little bit of this, but give me a bit about your background. You said you also went through a boot camp, but pivoted to being a recruiter instead. Would love to hear that story, and then we can dive into debating whether it's a good time or not to even go through boot camp, and what it looks like to job search.
Definitely. Thanks for having me, Aaron. Glad we're able to find some time. So really quick on my background. So I grew up in the South Bay area in California, on Shoreline Boulevard in Mountain View, so right where Google started, walking distance of their campus. And I went to Carnegie Mellon for my undergrad, studied economics. After school, had some miscellaneous sales jobs at startups. I actually got laid off right after I started my career at a Series B company, laid off the entire team. This was, I don't know, must have been 2016. I went through a boot camp, data science called Metis. And at the same time, I was consulting for a startup and helping them find their VP of product. And right after I finished Metis, I had some data science interviews, but ended up getting into recruiting. Worked at a company called Mojo Vision for a few years before starting Recruiting from Scratch. It always just made more sense for me to find other people jobs than myself. I love learning, what each of the jobs in a business did, and referring friends to either it's making intros or getting them interviews. And my friends always seem to be much more successful at interviewing than myself at times. So recruiting made sense for me to go into, and felt I was always pretty good at it and finding other people jobs. So, although I did a boot camp, I ended up kind of pivoting right after to finding a completely different role. Do
you feel like the bootcamp experience though, helped you have more context for tech and helping folks find jobs, or was it a distraction or a necessary step, you think, in your journey?
No, I think just generally, especially after getting laid off and finding, anytime you're going back and kind of training a new skill, I've always love working with data and being quantitative, and even in recruiting, there is a lot of data you can capture. Especially if you're looking at pass-through rates in interviewing, if you're looking at, some of it's basic response rates, but you really can look at recruiting quantitatively. It is helpful, and I can apply it there, but just taking time and learning a new skill, whether it's going back to school, especially if you're unsure of what to do in your career, can always be helpful, regardless or not if you end up making that, your exact career. So if you went through a software engineering boot camp, there's plenty of other roles besides just being a software engineer where you can apply those skills. Whether it can even be on the customer, I would say support, but account management side, if it's a technical company, there's sales you could go into where you have a technical sale. There's marketing that could be, technical. There's so many ways you can apply it. So having, an understanding of how the internals actually work of the software you're using is can be very helpful. So it is always possible, to do a pivot.
Yeah. I'm always thinking, and this is always the advice I offer folks, like I don't think you should do a boot camp if you're not actually wanting to learn how to program or be a programmer or not interested in it. But I do think this idea where if you could learn the most difficult hard skill especially for career changers, like in tech, then it really does open up a lot of doors. I think there's a lot of folks who are probably like you and, who seem to have great natural communication skills, connect well with people, could really add value, but it's hard to transition into tech. Like for me, for example, my background was, I didn't do economics, Carnegie Mellon. I went to, a liberal arts college, got a religious studies degree, and like no tech company was going to hire me, regardless of how great my soft skills were. But getting some hard skills that enabled me to think through, like, okay, I'm here. I could probably transition to basically do anything I want now. And I'm in the company. So I just was curious if that was for you. But I love that, man. That you and I've seen that before too, like both ways, where folks come through, a boot camp that I've started and then head right into product because they had a background in XYZ. I've actually seen the opposite as well, where recruiters come in and be like, "Hey, I've been finding all these other folks' jobs. Like this sounds more fun, right?" They feel like they're not carved out for that. So you started recruiting. When did you start your own like recruiting company, right? Because right now your organization is something that you created from scratch, correct?
Yeah, and also the name, Recruiting from Scratch.
Yeah, there we go. No pun intended.
I started recruiting. First company I worked at was Mojo Vision, and they are building they've pivoted now. They had run into issues with fundraising. They raised a total of $150 million over the several years. But they're building an augmented reality contact lens. I joined there as, it's a pretty small team and built it from, less than 10 people to 75-ish in less than 2 years. A lot of those roles were like very technical. So it took everything from like optics, photonics. There was, they're focusing on vision. There was electromagnetics. They had a machine shop. There's a lot of like very unique, I'd say half the roles I recruited, someone had a PhD, in some different discipline. Yeah. So it's very technical. More on the hardware side than software. They didn't quite have a software team yet. And then I left that company in 2018 as hiring kind of slowed down as they were trying to hit some milestones. And I started recruiting from scratch. And that came out of, I really love working with startups. Being the first recruiter is not the best job in the world at a startup. It could be good maybe doing it once or twice, but it's as much as I love recruiting, they are undervalued a lot of times in an organization. So that could be the amount, the salary they're given, the equity they're given. And I seeing an agency, it gave me the option of working with a handful of companies at once, allowed me to have control over a lot more things, and also just not making one decision on, will this startup do well. I worked with a lot of great companies at the time as my initial customers. Some of them, Scale AI is one of my first customers I had, Newfront Insurance. I worked with Digit at one point. I worked with Alchemy. If you're talking about Web3, I worked with them and they were a very small team, for several years. So I got exposure, working with a ton of companies. And that, just kind of led to building out. The first version of my recruiting company was RPO, which recruiter process outsourcing, pretty much. And you are basically embedded in a company. There's you still see that in a lot of places. You basically, can build up your recruiting team really quickly. But I switched my model to contingent search. So now, if a candidate gets placed, our team is, paid a percentage of their base salary. And that's, pretty much what we work on now. And I've done that for about the last 2 years. And we work with, a handful of clients, around 25 right now across the U.S. But we pretty much have coverage from Canada, to South America on where we're finding candidates. So
Awesome.
There's been a lot of changes, of course, in recruiting in the last few years, from a really crazy market, especially in Web3 and crypto and just everywhere in tech.
Yeah.
Just unlimited headcount, unlimited spend on especially recruiting, unlimited resources in a way of, what you could do, to now is a very different type of market. Companies are still recruiting, but there's a lot of people that were not job searching or haven't been unemployed in 20 years that are now unemployed, that have great backgrounds. So it's very different. And especially with companies going remote at one point during COVID, and now a lot of them switching to like a hybrid model or going back in person, makes it sometimes difficult to find the right candidate. Remote was just much easier to, hire for. And now I've seen several of our clients just either be back in New York City or San Francisco, which is, again, was always San Francisco, especially the Bay Area, was challenging recruiting environment. Just someone lives in the South Bay, it's unlikely to go to San Francisco, or they're in, if you're familiar with San Francisco, if they're in the marina, it's like getting them to go to the Mission can be a trek, right? So
yeah,
it just, that you kind of run into those challenges again. We've seen massive changes in the market, from just an incredible like end of a bull run to major slowdown in anything later stage.
Yeah, I'm curious. I'd love to, because so one thing that we do on the podcast is Peter and I are like the co-hosts, and every like 4 to 6 weeks we'll connect and just have a conversation that's just the two of us. And probably one of the hot topics obviously has been like the changes in the market. From like at one point I remember sending a message out to all of our students and graduates being like, look, y'all, I've never seen this before. Like, this is insane. Like, you can get jobs so easily. To now everyone's obviously insanely nervous because it seems like everyone's being laid off. And although like I think one of the things that we've tried to pick through is that, still we're in a macro environment where there's been some burn off of that bull run. And I think it's easy for us to believe that, oh man, like tech is dying, this isn't a good field. It couldn't be further from the truth. Obviously, like the long-term trajectory of this has not changed much. It's just that none of us, especially us that are younger, I think you and I are included in that quote younger group, we're not used to these like larger trends, right? We haven't been around the job market that much. And so for us, we kind of felt like this is just the way it's always going to be. Like it's just up and to the right for forever. So I'm just curious, like, we were talking a little bit before we started recording, and you said something about you're seeing engineers, I think you just said it again, that you would have never imagined who were looking for a job, who are now looking for a job. What's like the profile of someone like that who maybe have been laid off recently as a software engineer, who's having a difficult time finding their next gig? And then I'd just be curious from your opinion, like why do you think it is they're having a hard time?
Yeah. Hard time is maybe relative versus what it was like, a few years ago when recruiters were much more aggressive in hiring, and they would fill a candidate's in-mail LinkedIn inbox and their email with a ton of opportunities, and now it's definitely changed. There are a lot of senior engineers that are searching where maybe they're not used to being in that position where, one, just being unemployed, right, not having an opportunity or getting laid off. But I think having just less, opportunities available. I'm still seeing them able to actually, if you're a senior engineer, you're employable, you'll be able to find something. It may take, a few months and you're not employed, which is unusual, but there's still opportunities out there, and still plenty of companies hiring or backfilling roles. For some examples, I mean, there's Google had layoffs of, sometimes there was an engineer, someone there for 15 or 20 years that had built probably core parts of the products. They hadn't really thought about finding a job, and of course, their situation is very different. They've worked at Google for a long time, so I can imagine, if they've done very well. But now finding an entirely new opportunity. I think a part we discussed is how do you, if you're trying to break into this new, either a new industry or just an entirely new job, like how are you going to go about doing that? And I had to, given I've done a boot camp, I have experiences firsthand. I've had friends who have gone through software boot camps and other boot camps, and you're going to run into the same challenges, and you really have to be a certain motivation and persistent, to get through it, and it's going to be hard regardless of the timing of it, right? At some point you get a lucky break and something happens, but there's things that when I was laid off, that of course, something I told myself that I would do my best to prevent it from ever happening to myself again. And this was in 2016, so a very different time.
Right.
But making sure that if it did happen, I would have opportunities available like pretty quickly. And one of that eventually turned into starting a recruiting company where I'm always finding new companies to recruit for. Even right now, we have several where still need to find engineers right there. We need to hire 4 people. We have some later stage companies that still want to hire 100 engineers, this year. Right. So it's still out there.
Well, that'd be, I'd love to talk. Let's hit this idea like resilience. Like, how do you maybe make yourself resilient? Because I'm totally interested in that. First, would love to just hear your opinions on like trends. So one thing I noticed, for example, is it was really scary, honestly, for a little bit, where a lot of our grads, even like, I'm used to, I've gone through hundreds of boot camp students and grads, and I can kind of tell you, I think our program is built in such a way where we have a test, so there's no like fresh, brand new beginners who like are just completely in the dark. But I can tell like which students are going to be finding a job very quickly. And recently, my prediction was that they wouldn't not be able to find a job, but those who would normally find a job quickly would just have a longer journey, right? And I was nervous because I wouldn't know if that was true or not. And like in the last 2 weeks, I just saw bam, 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 like 3 or 4 of them got hired at much higher salaries than I was previously used to, which I thought was an interesting trend. So one like hypothesis I have, and again, this is total speculation, is that as we see layoffs happen, a lot of times it's obviously for cost cutting. And so we see folks like, if you're tenured at Google for a long time, you're obviously at the top 15% of the salary range. And sometimes it's easier to lay those folks off and then bring in newer talent. Do you think, that's true, that companies are probably more, likely to hire fresher talents, less experience, because now they're actually worried about costs, whereas before they're like, I don't care what we pay. We need someone who can start producing now.
I mean, that's I've seen, especially, so a lot of the clients I've seen hiring are pretty early stage in finding, I think even, depending on the role, a new grad at boot camp, can be quite a good hire if it comes from like the productivity you'll have at work. I think there's, I've seen, trends with remote work, it's enabled people to have like multiple opportunities at once, right? Given you have the ability to, and I've met people in New York City or engineers that have done this, that, have multiple jobs somewhere. Just given that's what software should enable you to do, right? Is be hyper productive. And, I can do that too at recruiting from scratch, of just building some nice automations on the back end that make work much more efficient. So I do think it's a mix of things of, companies, I have seen them maybe looking for people to work longer hours, of just, it's what's needed, so you can hire, less people to do something, to complete a project. And I don't know if I necessarily see someone hiring a new grad with just learning the skills to maybe be the appropriate fit for all jobs, of course, right? There is institutional knowledge and just general knowledge of software that you can't learn immediately. That takes a long time, or just trial and error, right? What works, what doesn't. But there definitely is an thing of finding someone motivated, putting in the hours, like the work, even as an engineer, right? I think there was a trend of like limited amount of time you'd have to put in, I should say trend, limited amount of time for software engineering work, right? The job was, once you kind of got used to it, was pretty easy to do or not as demanding. But there's several things companies are looking for with cost cutting, trying to get to profitability. And the big thing of software should enable you to have, some really great margins with a limited headcount, right? That's the big, you shouldn't have to keep growing headcount, to build a company. So I haven't seen that as often of, we don't always do junior hires or someone without a few years of experience. But I can see that being, just with some compensation base salary and total comp I've seen from very senior engineers, like, for someone coming out of a boot camp is much more like reasonable in terms of the total comp. So I can see, that happening. But, one of the many changes, of course, over the last few years, are the bootcamp grads that you've seen, are they primarily going to early stage companies? Are there specific places they're targeting?
Yeah, I'd say the sweet spot for us is finding a small to medium sized company that is, I don't know that necessarily say bootstrap, but profitable. So they're not making a big splash, right? It's not always the hottest thing to do, but it's like a stable, steady company that's sort of exists in its own world, right? I mean, these micro situations for a lot of tech companies are that they're just not feeling and they're not affected by the macro situation, right? So maybe the response you see from a small or medium-sized tech company is in reaction or in preparation for what the big companies are doing, but in large part, it's not affecting them, right? So I think that's why it's just taken longer for our grads to sift through and find those opportunities. But they're still there, and I think I've consistently seen, the salaries actually increase for our grads too, where that kind of surprised me that they went from the 60s to 70s. Again, like this is software engineering, so like your pay jump next year could be 90, and then the year after that could be 130, and then 300, or it's just depending on where you're working, right? It's insane, the spectrum. But it went from like the 60s and 70s to now like the 80s to 90s. Is really what I'm seeing. And I'm, again, this is all just speculation, but part of me is thinking that companies are more willing to find, someone who's passionate and hungry and, costs less than a senior developer at this stage, because they're trying to prepare a little bit, trying to save some costs, but still need that productivity. Well, man, I would love to hear a little bit about, I noted this a minute ago, but like this idea of resilience. You'd said you got laid off and you said you never wanted to experience that again. And I have a couple of thoughts on that. We've had, one guy, I don't know if you follow him on LinkedIn. He's kind of like the LinkedIn god, Justin Welsh, on the podcast. And he's very into this idea of solopreneurship. And he basically built this massive LinkedIn following. And one of the things he talks about often is resiliency in terms of starting your own thing, right? And that's obviously more or less what you did. Is you're like, okay, no one can fire me from the thing I started. But are there other ways to, in terms of building your network out actively while you're at a job still, that will help you build resilience?
I think there was so several things that I thought about and implemented. One is we're worked out, or going to Carnegie Mellon is of course very helpful in tech, and leveraging that network. So one thing I did was build out a group called It's called CME Tech and Entrepreneurship. It's been changed several times through iteration, but it started off throwing events just in San Francisco. So finding, interesting alumni, and there's many of them, from CMU, and then having them at an event. Example, Aditya Agarwal, who's one of the first engineers of Facebook and CTO Dropbox, who's at one of the events I threw, and had a panel with him. There was Justin, who started Iterable. Right, first through events in San Francisco, his company Lean Plum, started by Mom Chill. He was a CMU alumni. They had a great building and space that I could use, and just started, building some community and events, and not necessarily I wasn't asking for anything at the time, but over the years, the network, of course, really grows, and there's a few thousand people in a Slack group we have, and after several years of building it. Another thing I did was, I've always liked, which is probably why I became a good recruiter, is sending cold emails and messages and just reaching out to someone, want to just talk about their career, a job that I potentially wanted to do. And it would happen if, I was chatting with product managers or someone in marketing, someone in sales. But I think I would just send like one new conversation a day that I would have with someone. And then over time, of course, if you do that for a year or two, like that's a lot of conversations you have and a lot of people that you've talked to and met. And a lot of the people I talked to have really interesting jobs or eventually started a company, raised a lot of money, and, you're just building that relationship over time. Some of those, of course, if they work at a company that has an opening, like you chat about it, you approach it in the right way, where if you have a good conversation, you can mention, there's also an opening at this company. Can you refer me to it? And most of the time they will, right? As long as you have the right skill set and fit, for that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and that's something we talk about all the time. One, I think very few people have the luxury of, the Carnegie Mellon network.
Yeah.
So that may not be so applicable, but this idea. So you're saying that while you're working at another company, for the sake of networking, you're just sending out like a daily, was it LinkedIn message? What's the context for that? And then what do you say? Like, because I get these messages all the time, right? Where someone tries to connect with me and like, would love to chat. And I'm like, yeah, never just like gonna chat. Like that's not part of my schedule, is just to like chat it up. How do you actually get someone to talk to you, I guess?
Well, I think one is, it really depends who you're reaching out to, right? So if you're like trying to reach out to a senior executive about chatting with them about your career, unless you have some really strong connection, right? They went to your same school. They're from the same area as you. I don't know, there's some group that you're involved in, right? Like you can find a connection, maybe they'll chat with you. But if you're finding that, if you're able to find a common connection, that's the easiest way, right? Reaching out, hey, can you chat? I'd love to learn more about, I don't know, you could say their career or something they've done, or just really asking for help. Again, if you're making a career change, people are much more receptive of helping you, right? But if you're, I don't know, later in your career and there's not, if you've worked for 10 years, it may be a bit different, right, of doing that message. But if you're coming out of school, especially undergrad, if you're coming out of a boot camp, you have that as part of your message. Like you'd love to learn more about their job and day to day and what they're doing. If you're just messaging like a senior software engineer, not a ton of people are asking them that question, right?
Yep.
So there's that option. And it could be a LinkedIn message. You can connect with someone on LinkedIn. You can usually find people's emails pretty easily. All of those strategies. But I always track, of course, being a recruiting, track every email I send, and I can see open rates and everything, right? So, not everyone is going to respond. So that's where you have to think of how often does it convert into a call. But people are usually pretty receptive, right? I honestly don't get too many messages of, like, I will respond if someone is, writes a message of like very clear what they, what they'd want to chat about or help with. I'll at least respond to the email. Times I'll hop on a call, if it can be helpful, I'm just trying to figure out,
Yeah.
If that's the case. I've gotten a lot more of them recently. But then sometimes I'm surprised people don't actually respond when I do respond. So there's another thing too, right? They could reach out, but there's no follow-up, which is another key part of it too. Like the follow-up is important in making sure, over time, if you're trying to build your network, you need to like keep people engaged, which is a hard part, checking in. And that could be simple as like, if you eventually get on, if it's a LinkedIn message or even texting someone. I have a lot of people I've sent cold messages to long ago that now I text pretty often and just ask questions around if something pops up that maybe they have expertise on, especially in recruiting. I've sent someone who was the VP of talent at Instacart, like during hypergrowth, and now I can just text him questions if I have anything that pops up, or he's run an agency before. Hey, can I see your contract? Like, what have you used as your terms, right? So if you can eventually get on that level, it's helpful. You want to make sure to follow up, like after the call, thank them, whatever it may be. I think that's a part that people also miss, of just the follow-up. But
yeah, and what I see from like our grads, and we talked about this probably episode a long time ago, is that lack of follow-up usually stems from like a lack of confidence, right? You don't actually believe that you have what it takes to be a software engineer. And so the initial assumption is, I reach out to you, you're a senior level engineer at a company I want to work at, you don't respond. My immediate thought is, oh man, this guy must think I'm an idiot, like doesn't have what it takes. But in reality, like they probably just don't want to respond. They might be busy, they might miss it. And I had this example early on in my career where I was searching for a software engineering job, reached out to a guy, he didn't respond. And I was just committed. I was like, I am going to hammer him with emails every like other day or so until he either says, sorry, no thanks. At that point, like if you keep on hammering, it's harassment, but up until that point, I was like, I'm just going to like have this happy ignorance of, I'm just assuming you want to talk to me. And, the second or third email, he was like, hey, so sorry. These fell through the cracks. Would love to talk. We got on a Google Chats, talk, and he just gave me the lay of the land, what his company was doing. He was excited about it. He loved it. And then like a few weeks later, I was like, hey, actually, I applied for this position, and sure enough, he got me in for an interview, got me an offer. I didn't take the offer, but it was just sort of a success story of like, that was just one, right? And if I did that for 15, 20, 50 companies, how much better of a shot would I have than, just cold applying, especially at this stage for our grads. It's probably not going to work, right? Like, there's something that sets you apart.
Yeah, especially for applications have really picked up. I just brought on someone for a sourcing role, my team, and I've never seen so many applications. Like there was 1,000 applications for that role in a few weeks, right? And I can look through them pretty quickly, but even then, like setting yourself apart, your resume, specific things you put on there, it's not really possible, especially at a boot camp too. Your experience is all pretty similar, right? You list all pretty similar projects, maybe
totally
your background before, right? You went to like a great undergrad that's recognized. You worked at a like firm, company that people know. It'll be much easier, at sometimes for that, right, to maybe get an interview. But if you, with those conversations, right, it led to an offer, but also someone that, then you have hopefully a still strong relationship with that person, or, they're understanding why you didn't take that offer. But, then in the future, that can turn into another opportunity, or even hiring that person themselves, right, when you're working at a company, which,
right.
If the person you've met, it's always helpful, like that maybe they join your team in the future, you can hire them somewhere else, refer them somewhere, right, help them out too. But back to, the multiple follow-ups, right, that's something we also are doing in recruiting. There's, multiple stages you want to do in an outreach, and, it could just be sometimes the email I can't miss it in the inbox. It's not top of mind, or like they just don't respond immediately, right? But multiple follow-ups is helpful. There are times people just ignore it, or they don't care, or they're not interested, they don't respond. That does happen, but follow-ups, just even trying to get someone on the call. It takes a few times,
Yeah.
right? And usually the worst thing they can say is no. I mean, other times I've gotten rude responses from engineers many times. Some people are rude, but you just got to live with it. It happens.
Yeah.
But,
Yeah.
most times
It's like sort of mindset is the most important piece, because I'm sure you experience that as a recruiter, like you said, getting rude messages of staying positive and not letting that like construct a false identity of who you are. Because it can feel like you get 10 rejections in a row, and suddenly you start questioning your whole
yeah.
your whole life, and then you get that win. You're like, oh wait, I'm not a loser. I just had a bad streak here.
Yeah.
That can be difficult for sure.
And I think as you're going through an interview process, or just the whole process of finding a job, it's really thinking about which parts of you, like if you're getting a lot of opportunities in interviews, like the first round, and then not making it through, I think then it's really critically looking at which parts you need to improve on, right? And I sometimes have a tendency to fall on like what's easiest that I can do, especially trying to grow the company. There's certain things I'll fall back on as like my default, I would call procrastination, but easy things to do that I think move stuff forward, right? But if you're struggling on like systems architecture and different parts of the interview process, really you need to focus on and like improve on those pieces, right? If your problem isn't finding that first interview, it's just getting through the process. Like there's resources out there that, either offered by the boot camp or, finding friends that will help you with, or even one of those engineers, you could find someone that's been through interview process that can help train you.
That's a perfect excuse to reach out.
Yeah. Just getting help on those things and because rejections will happen, but then really trying to understand like where are you falling through in the process?
Yeah.
Is it just your technical skills aren't strong enough? You could be applying to the wrong companies, right? If a company's building a database product, a lot of the engineers maybe have a PhD or some they went to a top school studying computer science. That's a very different type of software engineering than if you go to a company that's maybe like building a very simple web app. You're not building any like novel infrastructure. Very different type of software engineering. So you also have to look at the company you're applying to. If you want to go work at Google immediately out of a boot camp, like you should. It's possible. I've seen it many times, but the people that have worked there have incredible backgrounds, or some people have studied they had a PhD in physics before, and I can't. A lot of times I'm much better at certain things than I am, and I can't even compare myself to that person, right? And that would happen at Metis too, where
slay the interview.
Yeah. The best students I saw at Metis had a PhD in physics, and I had a BA in economics. My math skills were decent, but very different if you talk to a physicist about anything dealing with numbers, and usually make the best data scientists. They're just on an entirely different level, right, of what they're able to do. So I think it could be hard even comparing yourself to. It would happen at Carnegie Mellon too when I took actually the Intro to Computer Science course. It's called 15112. I don't think I've ever felt as bad as I did as taking that course and knowing that I'll never be the type of computer scientist that I see as someone from CMU. A lot of them were, freshmen. Like the freshmen at Carnegie Mellon when I was a senior were the ones helping me with my assignments, right? Yeah. This was like their first semester at school, and they were already great at coding. They were so much further ahead. But I also realized that if I wanted to be the best at something, computer science probably wasn't the thing for me, right? Because they were just much better than I was. So I also had to be realistic and find, where I could really be successful. And
I think that's natural, right? I mean, there is a difference between like you don't like this, like for example, like for boot camp students, folks who are trying to get into our boot camp, there is a contingency of people that think this is the easy route. Like, I'm just going to go through this thing. We get a job. I'm work from anywhere. I'm going to be rich. Like, that's great. My cousin did it. This is the best thing in the world. Let's just go. Those folks shouldn't do this, right? But there's also a contingency of folks that probably are wired more like me and maybe you, sounds like as well, who, yeah, I could be a software engineer, but I'm never going to be like that guy over there, right? The folks who come in as, and even one of our, I talked about this, we had a guest a few episodes ago, this guy named Eldon, who I used to work with, who I knew from college, and you can just tell, like straight away from college, like, oh, this guy, he's built to do this. Like, his brain just operates like this, and I can still do it. I'm just a different kind of software engineer, right? I'm communicative. I'm probably a great mentor. I'm creative. I love to probably problem solve more. I think about the product more, whereas they're going to go deep on the problem solving, the engineering, architecture, design. All those things are necessary. You're just going to be a different kind of engineer. And then sometimes, like you said, and I felt that way too, that it was part of it was a step on the path that led me to where I am now, right? Like, I'm much more fit to help others, kind of like you, and a different on the other side of it, right? Much more fit to help others get there than I am to go there myself. Like, I'm not necessarily, I felt like I was leaving so many parts of my personality checked at the door when I was only evaluated on this one measure, which was, code quality. It's like, well, I have all these other things to offer. And I think that's kind of the message here, is that in some ways that the current environment for careers is so much different than it was, 15 years ago. Like, we have micro careers, and the collection of skills that we gather, sometimes they can be a distraction for sure. You can take wrong moves, and that's possible. But I think more or less, as long as you keep going and follow the things that you're interested in and commit to working hard, I think more or less you'll carve out a unique career. Like, you don't have to follow a singular path. And it sounds like that's what you in some ways your message is as well. Is like, if you get laid off, it could be an opportunity to transition, even in this environment where things are difficult. As long as you're building your network and following the things you're passionate about, more or less, like, you should be able to have an opportunity to transition. The timeline might be not the one that you want, but as long as you don't quit, there's opportunity. I've rarely seen people who would just like, I've never seen someone who just like got banished from tech forever because, they got laid off once.
I think especially right now as going in this term, if you were, any type of degree, if it's a boot camp, or if you even went, to maybe pursued a master's for a few years, right? And you let, if financially it makes sense for you to do that, or go for an MBA, regardless, right? That's 2 years that you basically have of waiting, which, not a bad time, or you're not missing, there's other opportunity costs of doing that. But, if you're looking for making a transition, it could be, good period to wait in someone a year or two, right? Where there is more recovery in tech and things are more clear of what's going on. There's still lots of movement, of course, in early stage startups, but it depends if I'd say it's much more chaotic, and it could be quite, not, I wouldn't always recommend for everyone to work at those types of companies, because they can be just a mistake at times at working at the wrong company, or even choosing the right one. But back to, I think even with the persistence of in where you can have like a really unique skill set. I have a friend that went through App Academy, and before he was working in finance, he did sales briefly, but had a really strong finance background. And during App Academy, he turned off his phone for probably 3 months. I couldn't contact him. That's how dedicated he was. I'm not exaggerating. He disappeared, right? He just studied. Really dedicated to it. And that's the time you have to put in for some boot camps. I mean, it's not easy in any way, and it's going to be one of the, I think, more stressful events in your life of just learning, because it's so accelerated and there's so many concepts. You can't learn that much in, Carnegie Mellon's a 4-year program, right? And you can't learn everything in 6 months. You can build stuff in 6 months. You can get there, but you're going to be missing a lot of concepts. But eventually he moved into, he actually worked at a startup that closed down, but moved into working in finance. So at a bank and then a private equity firm, but had a really strong finance background. So his understanding of what he's actually building, is very different than if you hire an engineer that doesn't have that background. He can work through financial models. He can, and do the similar things that an investment banker can do, but he can also write code and build software. So there's like a huge advantage, especially he's found a place, private equity firm that pays very well, of course. The teams are quite small, but, he has a lot of insight, and, can talk to not just engineers, but anyone on the investment side too, if needed, and really understand what you're building. So, there can be major advantages if you have this strong skill set previously, and then you can apply software to it, which gives you, a way to set yourself apart. And there are a lot of companies that do that. There's a lot of insurance software companies that are building out products. You can look at any industry really and have like a really good insight into what you're building, which some engineers don't have. A lot of them do, but can give you a really good product sense. So there can be like huge advantages of applying, building out this software skill set to a different career you've had before.
Yeah, absolutely. We've seen some of the best grads who are able to leverage their previous backgrounds and not say, oh, I shifted and I left that behind, but to say, hey, I'm capitalizing on that. I'm utilizing that into this industry too. Well, as we come up against time here, any final either party pieces of wisdom, plugs, other ways our listeners can connect with you that you might be able to help them?
Yeah, if a lot of our clients are early stage companies, so that would be seed, series A, B, round companies. They still are hiring for a lot of engineers, product managers, product designers. So we have a jobs page with a lot of stuff on there. But I'm always on LinkedIn, sometimes on Twitter, but feel free to reach out. But Aaron, I appreciate you having me on the podcast. It was a fun chat.
Thanks, man. I'm sorry. To be clear to the whole world, I'm the one who's rescheduled several times. I always seem to get sick on the day we record. So
last time thanks
for enduring
the weather issue. So that's
yes, there was a ice apocalypse in. You should see our yards, man. Everyone's yard in Austin has like a 4-foot stack of limbs because we took down our fence. It was insane. We were without power for like 4 days.
Wow.
But anyway, thanks again, Will. I appreciate you coming
Definitely. On. Thanks, Aaron.
All right, that does it for today's episode of the Develop Yourself podcast. To learn more about our online code school, Parsity, visit parsity.io. That's parsity.io. Check out Dev30, which is our 30-day JavaScript program at dev30.xyz. Then we've got some other shameless plugs in the show notes if you want to learn more. Thanks for listening.